Tonight we are dealing with Egyptian myths as they relate to the afterlife of man. So we must clarify not only our knowledge or lack of knowledge of the Egyptian life way, we must also clarify the different positions and convictions held within Egypt itself during a long period of its history. We cannot say, for example, that the Egyptian believed this or that. At different times, the Egyptians believed both this and that, and several other things. A people developing a culture over a period of nearly 5,000 years passed through innumerable phases and moved from one cultural platform or level to another. Therefore, during the long course of Egyptian religion, nearly every belief known to man today was contemplated and considered. Some of these beliefs never came to flowering. Others mingled in strange chemistries to produce effects we would consider fantastic. Still others moved inevitably toward philosophy and ultimately to science. Thus we have among Egyptian remains evidences of nearly every phase of mortal thinking, from theism through polytheism to monotheism to atheism. It is impossible, therefore, to make some broad statement as to the way the Egyptian regarded his destiny in the universe. We only know with reasonable certainty that in addition to the development of indigenous beliefs within the structure of Egyptian society, Egypt was bounded by several other countries and also by other advanced cultures which variously contributed and modified Egyptian thought. We know of the effect of the great dynasties of Ethiopian kings upon Egyptian learning. We know also the impact of Semitic thought from the valley of the Euphrates. We cannot fail to recognize the late appearance of Greek modification. All of these and other forces, some of them probably coming from far Asia, influenced the gradual development of Egyptian religion. Egypt, as the cradle of Mediterranean civilization, also exercised in its own turn a powerful influence upon later cultural patterns. A great part of Mediterranean culture, including arts, philosophies, religions, and sciences, a great part was modified or changed by Egyptian culture. And we can trace Egyptian elements in nearly all religions of the region, including Christianity. Thus Egypt assumes a very important position in our thinking. And we must try to understand something of the experience through which the Egyptian passed in the development of his culture. Several Egyptologists insist that early Egypt was unaware of any monotheistic teaching, unless we assume such teachings to have been achieved in the nome of Heliopolis. Actually, there is much to indicate that the early Egyptians did contemplate the possibility of one divine being at the root of life. This certainly did have its day of recognition during the reign of Amenhotep IV, whom we know as Akhenaten. This pharaoh was a complete monotheist. But of course, this is attributed in part to the Semitic blood in his family. The Egyptian, we know, was early concerned with the state of himself after death. To study his art and the psychological impact of his numerous and diversified achievements is to come to one conclusion about which there seems to be no difference of opinion. The Egyptian loved life. He was not a person burdened with nostalgia or remorse. Even though in many periods he must have had a difficult time, his country was riddled with wars, his leadership was frequently inadequate. But above all, and in spite of all, he loved life. From the beginning, then, death was approached with a rather strange attitude. Death to the Egyptian was not a release from anything. He did not look forward to a blessed state in the world beyond. In the same spirit, death was not a reward for anything, because punishments and rewards were familiar to him, and he accepted them as part of his natural existence. We are not surprised, therefore, to find that there is no concept of heaven as we understand it, or conviction of hell as we fear it in Egyptian religion. The Egyptian realized that the individual had to depart from this world. Naturally and inevitably, the Egyptian also believed and required the belief that death was not the end of human experience. It seemed much easier, even to the early Egyptians, to assume that death was merely a separation of a being from a body. The body returned to the earth, or perhaps later was magnificently embalmed and placed in a gaily ornamented sarcophagus. The Egyptian was convinced that the soul within the body lived on. He did not believe that death represented any essential change in the nature, temperament, disposition of the person. It was a change of place only, not a change of essential state. It never occurred to him that death would transform the living into superior beings or inferior beings. He was not, therefore, inclined actually to worship the dead, because it would be like simply worshiping some relative whose limitations we already recognize. This might seem to vary somewhat from the phenomenal facts available, but we must remember that the deification process in Egypt, like that in China, and essentially like that in ancient Japan prior to the rise of a comparatively recent efflorescence in Shintoism, that this deification of the dead was restricted to the ruler, inasmuch as Egypt was a theocracy. In Egypt, the king, or Pharaoh, was a god, was the embodiment of God, was the instrument of God in this world. He was the extension of the divine power into the human state. But early, the Egyptian made another discovery, which affected him considerably in his psychology of life. He realized that the Pharaoh as a symbol and the Pharaoh as a person, these were two distinctly different things. Pharaoh as a symbol, as a concept, was divine. But Pharaoh as a person was not always adequate, not always sufficient to his own divine responsibility. Thus Pharaoh was an immortal mortal. He had divine attributes, and the concept was worthy of veneration and worship. But the Egyptian was too much of a realist to ignore the little man under the concept, to ignore the fallibility of the human being. In his religious art, therefore, even the great monumental productions of the state, Pharaoh must also ask for forgiveness. And like the Emperor of China, he must seek with the same humility as his people the presence of the great gods. Pharaoh was required to be an initiate of the state mysteries. And if he was unable to meet the requirements of these mysteries, he could not rule. Pharaoh in Egypt was a term which could be either male, female, or both. The Egyptian descent of royalty was essentially matriarchal. The descent was measured from the mother's side and not the father. Very often brother and sister ruled together, therefore, as Pharaoh. And under such conditions, they were regarded as the visible divisions of an undivided, invisible power. Also, amazingly enough, if Pharaoh was a woman, she must wear not only male, but female attributes. And if Pharaoh was a man, he must also wear both male and female attributes. This is not uncommon in theocracies or divine states of government. The same is true in Tibet. The same was true in the rise of the Christian hierarchy, as the bishops, cardinals, and the pope wear vestments which combine male and female garments. Thus, if Pharaoh was a woman, she wore an artificial beard on state occasions. And the Pharaoh wearing the full regalia of his office. If he was a man, always wore suspended from his back the skin of a lioness, and was referred to as male before and female behind. Thus the androgynous concept of Pharaoh also early developed within the Egyptian consciousness. Pharaoh as God, therefore, was regarded as having a unique destiny. But this destiny was not generally shared and was reserved for the members of the royal dynasty. For the rest, the Egyptian did not have what we would term any tendency, any pronounced tendency, either to deify his dead or expect from them in another life attributes which they did not possess in this life. During the power of the Scholar Council of the pharaohs in Egypt, there was, however, a magical factor introduced. And in Egyptian religion, there is no essential division between theology and magic, any more than there was an essential division between theology and science. They were considered one body of learning. The Egyptian, because he believed in magical powers, frequently assumed a kind of spiritism. He believed that the dead did not necessarily depart happily, but if their bodies were returned to the dust and disintegrated, then their contact with the earth was gradually dissolved. The Egyptian dead, in the form of the man-headed hawk, is therefore constantly represented as seated at the foot of the mortuary couch, the soul gazing quietly upon the mummified face of its own body. To assure, therefore, a certain relationship between the living and the dead, the Egyptians developed the process of embalming their heroes, scholars, sages, priests, and great persons, binding them to their body by the perpetuation of that body. The Egyptian believed that he could hold the souls of the dead to the service of Egypt, that they could never fail to be present as long as their bodies were there. This probably underlies the concept of the mummification of the dead. The Christians later embalmed their dead, but this was for another motive, because the early members of the Christian communion believed, literally, that in the second resurrection, or in the resurrection of the dead, the human being would reinvest his body, and that the body should be preserved for this purpose. The Egyptian, however, did not mummify from any such considerations. The dead, consequently, for the most part, particularly in early times, were buried in the knee chest position, which is called the embryo posture. They were placed in a comparatively circular opening in the ground, sometimes lined with bricks. This knee chest posture, or embryo position, was to indicate that the deceased person was passing into a kind of second infancy, or was to be reborn in another world. Therefore, that his grave was the embryo of another life, that he was to be born from the earth as from a womb. Not, however, was this birth to be regarded as different, merely in another place. And in this other place, the Egyptian believed firmly that the state of the deceased person would be determined and measured by his earthly condition. If, therefore, he had made certain achievements during his material lifetime, he would continue to enjoy these achievements. If he did not achieve, he would not have the same degree of enjoyment. Later, magic came in again. And so literal did the concept of the afterlife become in the Egyptian consciousness, that it was considered proper, in fact obligatory, to bury with the dead any such belongings, household goods, ornamentations, raiment, and even food that the soul might need in the afterlife. There was a time at which the Egyptians, like many other ancient people, the Chinese for example, actually believed that the deceased person lived his second life in his own grave. Therefore, his grave was usually a series of rooms or apartments suitable to supply him with all pleasures and conveniences. The walls were well decorated, not only with pleasant scenery, but with admonitions to morality, virtue, and ethics, so that he might live in the constant sense of improvement. He was supposed to enjoy his afterlife in the same way that he had enjoyed his material estate. Later, the articles buried with the dead were reduced to symbolical equivalents, and it was believed that a tiny image of a servant was just as good as the servant. The Egyptian apparently had already learned to realize that in some mysterious way the utility of these objects depended not upon themselves, but upon the mind of the person who was deceased. If the mind of the dead vitalized these objects, they became useful. If this mind did not vitalize them, they did not become useful. Later, we find the gradual rise of one of the most important cults of Egypt, and that was the rise of the great Osirian cycle, centering around the deity Osiris, who was regarded as the son of Saturn, and held later by the Greeks and Latins to be the equivalent of their Zeus or Jupiter. Osiris, however, combined in one person the attributes of many deities, and a number of later mythologies borrowed phases of these attributes. The philosophy of the Egyptian about Osiris is probably more profound than we realize. And here again we must pause for a second. Let us remember that Egypt was not a savage or untutored land. As we look upon the great architectural monuments of this people, we know that they were learned. We know also that we have a psychological tendency to discredit the learning of the past, or to depreciate anything that might cast a shadow on our own grandeur. But let us face it, the Egyptian was a civilized man. He was a thoughtful man. He had nearly every problem that we know today. We have this from the records. He suffered from high taxes and protective tariffs. He knew very much about debt. He had to borrow money at usurious rates of interest. He recognized property laws. He recognized social obligations. His courts were highly legislated and legalized. His jurists were well trained. His physicians were informed according to the best standards of their times. His scholars were educated. His philosophers were wise and noble. We cannot then assume that a man of this kind, or descent of such men, would over a series of thousands of years affirm the literal acceptance of fables and legends. We must more rightly observe that the sacerdotal mysteries of these people were concealed beneath obligations and oaths, and because they were part of the initiate system of antiquity, they veiled their doctrines in allegories and fables. We have accepted the fables as the facts, and because most of the ancient records are lost, if they were ever committed to writing, which is very doubtful, we have no way of correcting our own perspective. We can only suspect, and perhaps with generosity of spirit acknowledge, that these people must have had religions and philosophies suitable to their estates and reasonable to their attainments. This is true also of Greece, and which is perhaps a more immediate and more pressing example. For we know that Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle and Euclid were not foolish, superstitious men, and that the philosophies and theologies which they venerated could not have been merely lore and legendary. In Egypt, therefore, the moment we come upon a great cycle, such as the Osirian cycle, we must begin to parallel it with other comparatively equivalent cycles, such as the great Vedic cycle of India, and the Puranas and Bharatas. We can also see in it the theogony of Hesiod, and the great epic poems of Homer. We can parallel it with the Bharata, the Mahabharata, and the Ramayana, or with the great sagas of the Nordic peoples. These were tremendous accounts of things mysteriously set forth. Osiris in Egypt must then have not only been regarded as a deity by the humble, the uninformed, and the unschooled, but must have stood in the presence of the informed and the enlightened for principles, for realities, which they could comprehend and which their intelligence would demand. We are not therefore surprised to discover that the Egyptians early recognized Osiris as one deity within which a division of deities took place. Isis, Nephthys, Anubis, Typhon, Horus. These deities were not separate from Osiris. They were the very parts and members of himself. So we are able to appreciate why the 42 assessors of the dead in the ritual of the Psychostasia are all supposed to have been aspects of the deity himself, the God within whom all these things live and move and have their being, and that gods and godlings are really not separate creatures, but phases or aspects of one creature, one being. And this being for the Egyptian of the Middle Period was Osiris. He recognized Osiris in 4 principal attributes or forms, and these in themselves should tell us that we stand at the gate of a great philosophy. Osiris was first Osiris Ptah, or my Lord the Light. Ptah was the light of the mind and the light of the world. But it was more than intellect. It was the light which enlightened intellect. Therefore, perhaps Osiris Ptah was the Egyptian name or formula or symbol for the term that we call consciousness. Osiris Ptah was a potter. He was a great artificer, and he fashioned all things upon a potter's wheel in the nome of Memphis. Osiris Ptah fashioned first the great egg of the world, from which sprang forth both gods and men. Osiris Ptah was also the architect, the base and substance of those archetypal designs which are to be everywhere manifested through creation. Thus, the primary aspect of the deity was consciousness, containing within itself the design of all things, and manifesting that design through the initial action of creation, or as the Egyptian would insist, of generation. Because the Egyptians did not believe in spontaneous creations from nothing. They believed in eternal generations from antecedent causes. This is one of their basic tenets. The second phase of Osiris was Osiris Horus. And here we find the peculiar relationship of father and son. The father who is his own son. The son who is his own father. The Son who is the only begotten of the Father. The Son who bears witness. The Son through whom the Father must be approached. The Son who must intercede before the Father for the souls of the righteous dead. Horus, therefore, in the Egyptian symbolism, is certainly a representation of what we call mind. Mind as the firstborn of consciousness. Mind as the eldest creature of reality and truth. Mind as the source of ego, or the existence of selfhood. So that all things in themselves and of themselves are sons of the Father. And that all things partake of this parenthood and bear witness. Thus, Osiris Horus is actually the symbol of the conscious, individualized intellect, which is rooted in universal consciousness and is made ruler over the world. For Osiris so loved his own son that he gave him dominion over all things. This is intellect, or the power of reason, given dominion over the works of consciousness. We know from the ancient manuscripts and from the various appellatives applied to these deities that everything that we have said is actually included among the titles given to these deities. Therefore, we are not exaggerating. Horus, among his titles, includes the only begotten of Osiris. Also, another title is the firstborn of eternity. Another title of him is he who shall bear witness. Another title of him is the Redeemer. Still another, the Intercessor. He is also called the Bridge and the Door. And it is said of him that he guards the house of his Father. By the time you add maybe 100 or 200 of these appellatives together, you begin to get a fairly accurate concept of what the Egyptian was attempting to convey. The third aspect of Osiris was called Osiris Lunus, and he is represented, ornamented, and adorned with the lunar crescent. Osiris Luna was worshipped as the nocturnal sun, or the sun of the night. And from the terms and appellatives again, we find that he is the Lord of the astral light and presides over the mystery of imagination. He is therefore Osiris of desire, Osiris the beloved. He is the one who emerges as the great dreamer, the one whose dreams are always true. He represents the entire internal, subjective, psychological life of both man and the universe. He is the Osiris of hope, of faith, and of the great desire. He is the Osiris who rejoices in the music of the sistrum. He is the Osiris of drama, who wears the masks of many faces. He is the Osiris who moves with the spring and brings forth the harvest. He is the Osiris who is the spirit of growth. He is also the one who giveth his beloved sleep, so that those in their dreams may come to him. He is strangely a mystical deity. A deity not to be known by the reason, but to be found in the strange vistas of sleep. Something, as we find in their ancient writing, that is to be known by the doing. Now there's an interesting term, that which is to be known by the doing. It looks as though what the Egyptian is reaching for is our concept of experience. that God, that power which is experienced by man when he seeks within himself the source of life, when he moves from the objective to the subjective, he passes into the strange white path of the moon that leads in and away into the secret gardens of hope, where the shrine of the great God stands. Altogether, the symbolism, the poetry, the constant recurrence of the strange, subtle drama of these nocturnal ceremonies celebrated upon islands for the lights of torches tell us something of the mystical yearnings and longings and convictions of this ancient people. The fourth deity, or the fourth form of the god, is Osiris Typhon. Now, the Egyptians recognized Typhon as the principle of evil, or the principle of destruction. And from his name has come our word, typhoon, the great storm, the tremendous agitation of the elements. Actually, as we have said, the Egyptian did not believe in a principle of evil. He did not believe that Osiris was evil. He believed that Osiris in substance, as universal consciousness, was infinite good. Yet he makes what he would term evil, or what we regard as evil, as an attribute of this power. It has no separate existence. It is a condition of good. To the Egyptian, Osiris Typhon, represented frequently by the famous water horse, or the hippocampus, the hippopotamus of the Nile, living in water, mud, and slime, a strange, grotesque, ungainly creature, was the proper and natural and inevitable symbol for that broad term we now cover by the word matter. Osiris Typhon was the material or physical world, the physical body of things. We can thus understand why the god is represented with a living head adorned with the plumes of victory, his hands holding the triple scepters of the three worlds, but the lower parts of his body covered with the wrappings of the dead. These wrappings of the dead are the vista or sphere or world of Osiris Typhon, the abode of the dead. Thus, to the Egyptian, the material world was the nearest thing to evil that he could conceive. And yet we have already said that he loved it, that he did not view material life as punishment. He reviewed it, considered it as a natural course of things. Yet he could not fail to realize that this material world is a sphere of conflict, a sphere in which values are frequently obscured, a sphere in which life and death seem to be struggling constantly for dominion. And the great struggle of life and death is the typhoon. It is the tremendous whirlwind in the midst of which man finds himself. After the death of Typhon, who is finally overcome by Horus, this adversary takes upon himself the form of the great serpent Apep. And as the great serpent becomes the seducer, or the tempter, it is this fallen serpent which occurs again and again in their mythology. And in one of the later forms of the Egyptian ritual, the deity Horus is depicted holding a spear and standing upon the back of the serpent Apep, having driven his spear through the head of the creature. In another case, he is shown standing with one foot upon the serpent's head. And we are reminded of the somewhat similar, if though not identical, parallel that the woman shall bruise the head of the serpent, which we have in our Christian religion, and which becomes much more meaningful if we begin to understand the symbolism of our faith. So Osiris now becomes, rather obviously, the four conditions which make up the world. These conditions being consciousness, intellect, desire, and matter. And there is no doubt in any way that the Egyptian had attained this realization and was fully able to handle its implications and to extend it into the most abstract vistas of philosophy. Man, therefore, born into this world, came under the power of Typhon in one of his phases, attributes, or forms. As such, he became a subject, a vassal, or a servant of the prince of this world. Later, perhaps, the Greek emperors or the Roman Caesars. While here, he must render unto the emperor or to Caesar those things which belong to him. But he also must know that even this material world is part of the body of his blessed God, and therefore his religion and philosophy began to develop ethical and moral overtones. The struggle to restore the glory of his God in matter. The struggle to discover the glory of his God in himself. The Egyptian faced both of these decisions victoriously. He rose to great heights in his contemplation of these mysteries. Probably all Egyptians did not, any more than all peoples of the modern world make the most of their heritage of wisdom. But the priestly classes, the learned, the leaders, were certainly instructed in these matters. Now, after Osiris had been foully murdered by his own alter ego, his own lower self, his inevitable brother, Typhon, and was raised again from the dead through his own son, the Horus. He became the Lord of the quick and the dead, judging righteous judgment over the beings of the three worlds. The lifetime on earth, the so-called, or the mortal reign of the god Osiris was 28 years, which was the length of his duration, and which Plutarch suggests may be a subtle allusion to the cycle of the moon. After his death, he was divided. His body was divided into 14 parts. Some say 28 again. These parts were scattered throughout creation. And the pilgrimage of Isis, again, the wife, sister, other self of Osiris, gives us another dimension of this strange belief. When a brother and sister rule in Egypt as pharaohs together, each refers to the other, not as pharaoh, not as brother, not as co-regent, but always as myself in another. This is again the very concept of Isis, who is herself in Osiris. Now Isis represents in Egyptian mythology one of the two polarities of nature. The Egyptian, looking out around him in the world, beheld nature divided into two parts: nature above him and nature below him. He saw the air and the sky and the stars, and he saw Isis in the form of the goddess Nut, reaching out across the heavens, forming of her own body the pathway of stars. He also realized that the air was full of life, and perhaps full of spirits. He recognized all things growing from the earth into the air, passing therefore from an underworld to an upper world. And that growth toward the air, or upward into the air, was always toward the sun. In the Egyptian mythology, of course, Osiris is a solar symbol. The eye of Horus, or the Osirian eye, of course, is the single eye of the solar orb. Therefore, Osiris, riding in the great ship of the sun, floats across the heavens, diffusing his life and light through the mysterious reaches of the upper atmosphere, the ethers of space, the great sea of heavenly waters which envelops the earth. The sea, water, was anciently called Mari, Mary, Esau, Isis. Therefore, Isis is the great diffusion of ethereal nature through which the sun's eternal and energies and life forever flow. Now Isis has a sister, and this sister is Nephthys. And Nephthys bears upon her head a throne surmounted by a bowl, or a low, shallow dish. This bowl is the symbol of the under half of the earth's surface. Therefore, the above and the below are sisters. And where one ends, the other begins. And the energies which flow through space flow also downward into the earth, which is the abode of Nephthys. And the deity Nephthys later was revived among the Greeks as Hecate, the goddess of the underworld. Nephthys, sister, wife of Osiris, sister of Isis, sister of Anubis, of Typhon, sister and mother, nurse of Horus. All these attributes are interchangeable between Isis and Nephthys. And when Osiris is seated upon the great throne in the hall of the twin truths, as Lord of the quick and the dead, Isis stands upon one side of him and Nephthys upon the other. And they are the ancient counselors. And they are the ones who must say, we are content. The above and the below must agree. The interior and the exterior must agree. The superior and the inferior must agree. And this again perhaps is the basis of the great Hermetic axiom. That which is above is like unto that which is below. That which is below is like unto that which is above. And of this mystery is the generation of all things. Now where the bowl of heaven above meets the rim of earth below, there is the long line of the mountains. Now these mountains, or perhaps only the open sea, but there is the wall between the above and the below. And on this roaring ridge of division between that which is superior and that which is inferior, there stands another deity, who is really the product of the mingling. And this deity is Anubis, born of the sky and the earth, and standing forever upon the horizon of the sun. This is a very profound bit of thinking. For what is Anubis? Anubis is the jackal one, who principally lives in the night and is forever crying in the darkness. Anubis is also the faithful guardian protector and friend of the godly family. Because after all, he is only again Osiris as Anubis. He is part. He is not another deity. He is another phase of the deity. Now out of light and darkness, the above and the below, and their strange minglings, comes the being who is to be restored to us in one system of mythology after another. In the Grail cycle, he is Gurnemon, the old knight, who guards the destinies of choirs. In the Arthurian cycle, he is Merlin the magician, who goes to sleep in a house of crystal. In the Divine Comedy of Dante, he is Virgil, conducting the soul through the mystery of the underworld. In the mystery rituals of the ancients, he was the guide, the instructor, and also the one who vouched for the right of the candidate to advance into the rituals. He is still preserved in secret society rituals of this day. Anubis, then, is old and wise. Wise with the wisdom of the sky and the earth. Wise with the wisdom that comes from the motion of the sky upon the earth upon the sky. Or the motion of invisibles upon visibles, and contrary. How invisible causes bring visible things into being, and how all visible things change and modify the invisible worlds of which they are a part. So old Gurnemon, or Anubis, is wisdom, standing upon the horizon between light and darkness, the guardian of souls, the protector of the dead. Now when Osiris in his great ship of light passes triumphantly across the sky, accompanied by his retinue of attributes, because all these deities are parts of himself, he rides in a ship that has an eye upon it, because obviously the boat must see the way in which it is going. The Chinese do the same thing. They always put a pair of eyes on the front of their junks, because obviously ships will want to know the proper direction of travel. When the ship comes finally to the great gate of the west, it descends into the underworld. And when it reaches the edge of the underworld, there stands Anubis on the horizon to salute the dying sun of the world and the rebirth of the invisible sun. Now let's realize what happens. For it is said that the sun, when it goes to sleep, or the great ship goes downward beyond the horizon, that it enters into the plains of Alu, the house of shadows. And the house of shadows has 15 gates, leading in all directions. But there are 2 gates that are most great. And one is the gate of the diminishing, or of the departing, which is the great gate of the west. For into that gate passes the solar ship when darkness comes upon the earth. The regency of the world is turned over from the Osirian sun to the Osirian moon. The other gate is the great gate of the dawning, the gate of the east. And in the mysteries of the world of Alu, of all the gates, these are the 2 that the souls of men must most regard. For it is written in the book of the breathings that those who pass to sleep through the gate of the west will after a time depart from the underworld like the great ship of the sun through the triumphant gate of the east. Therefore all things will go down with the sun, will rise with the sun. and all souls that go down into sleep will awaken again when the great ship of the soul reaches the eastern gate of the horizon. Now we realize then, as we study it, that the ship of Osiris is actually the great ship of the doctrine of Eastern Buddhism, particularly of the Mahayana, or the great vehicle. It is also the navis, or great ship of Christendom, because the early cathedrals were fashioned in the form of the structure of a ship. We know that this is the ship of salvation, the ship of the redeemed. And in this ship, with Osiris triumphant, ride the souls of the justified dead. Having therefore somewhat established now our mundane and submundane geography, we can go on to a little more of the psychological phase of this. The land of Alu, the land where the spiders of darkness spin their webs, is like the body of Osiris, divided into 14 parts. These parts are no longer referred to, however, as planes or worlds or states or countries or even counties. These parts are referred to in the Egyptian ritual as houses. Therefore, there are 14 houses of the dead. The 14 houses of the dead are referred to in the book, The Breath of Life. And in it, it is said that in the great land of Osiris there are many houses. And therefore, that in this land there is an abode proper to each and to all. It is almost identically the same statement. In my Father's house are many mansions. And this great land that is guarded by the gates of Alu is called Amentet, which means, literally, the support of Amen. And the word Amen, in this case, is certainly the cause and source of our religious, we might say, formula, or strange invocational word, Amen. Amentet, then, is the land of Amen. Or let there be peace between us would be a proper greeting. Here again we have references to early Ethiopian scriptures, where the priest rising says, I speak with the voice of Amen. This is a Christian priest, for he speaks with the voice, so be it, or the voice of let there be peace. In other words, invoking or stating the presence of a divine power. The plains of Amentet, then, represent the foundations of the peace from the word tet, or tet, which is added. The place or the abode of that which is, so be it. So mote it be. And about this, let there be peace. Also, we find in Arabic the continuation of this in connection with reference to the prophet. For whenever a pious Muslim uses the name of the prophet, he always adds his equivalent to this thought. For he says, Mohammed, upon whose name be peace. Let it be so. It is. So be it. And this carries the entire concept, strangely enough, of Amentet, which means the peace of Ammon, or the place which Ammon has provided. The place, so be it. Now within this tremendous concept of another world or another life, we have many, many divisions. And because of the very same circumstances that affect our modern religious thinking, perhaps the Egyptian was more astute than we are, because instead of saying that heaven is a certain place and having another man disagree with you and saying it is another place, the Egyptian assumed that both men were right, because there was more than one place. You had the place you wanted, another man had the place he wanted. You could not say that heaven is like this or heaven is like that. Heaven is that which is, and so be it. For each man, so be it. It is strangely a world of deserts, of things expected, things presumed to be true. Whereas in the material world, the great hierarchy of the priests, who were referred to in ancient times as the voices of the Great One, instead of a world of priests ruling over this other world, Osiris was himself the great priest king, the psychopomp of souls, the Pharaoh, the immortal mortal, the God King. This was his world, his land. And why was he there? Because he had been foully murdered. Because he himself had been cast into darkness. Because his heavenly kingdom had been taken from him. And because he felt the great pain of sorrow. He was Lord of the dead because he had known death. And because he had known death, he bestows life. And he bestows that which he knows. And he redeems because he has been redeemed and has risen triumphant over death, and is therefore King of death. We find exactly the same concept in the Maundy ceremonies and services preceding Easter, where death rules the world for 3 days and 3 nights, where the candles are extinguished upon the tripod altar, where the disciples depart from their Lord and leave him in the darkness of the great pain. And therefore, in the Osirian cycle, death destroys death, overcomes death, and Osiris sits throned as the guardian of souls through the mystery of death. He has walked before them. He has left his marks upon the earth. They follow in his feet, or according to his steps. They return to him. They become him. And he carries them across the mystery of the other life. In the plains of Arlu, or in the great house of Amentet, there is the judgment throne, the magnificent abode of this Lord who is beneath the earth. The Egyptians sometimes represented Osiris as a mummy lying upon a low couch, and from every part of his body is bursting, growing grain, wheat, barley. All kinds of things are growing from him, because he is the life that is locked in the earth. He has descended into the earth, and from the earth he is forever escaping. And he escapes through the souls which turn to him and receive his way of life. Thus, in the underworld, there must be quite an empire envisioned. And on the threshold of this empire is the great experience of the transformation. For the Egyptians liked to think of death under the term transformation. They did not like the idea of mortality at all. Therefore, it was the great change from one thing to another, from one place to another. And to prepare and appropriately devise this occasion, the Egyptians had their magical mortuary rituals. With the Tibetans, these rituals were usually imparted before death. In Egypt, it was assumed that the soul, in the form of the ka, which locked within it the binu, or rational part, that this being, seated like the bird upon the tomb, could read the inscriptions, listen to the sounds, accept the instruction, and be guided thereby. Because of the fact that the Egyptian was also a rather conventional man in many things, the religious ceremonies of death were very elaborate. But the Egyptian was not much of a mourner. He was not much given to sitting around and wailing, because he could not conceive that death was bad. Well, the good gods would not have permitted it. But he had to show certain sorrows, certain respectable grief, things of that nature. So he simply hired professional actors to do it for him. And when an important person died, a request was sent for a suitable cast. And a dozen, 20, 50 expert mourners were engaged. These had no idea who was dead, but they howled uproariously, beat their brows and tore their garments, which were replaced afterwards. This was ceremonial, but it is not at all certain from any of the experiences that the Egyptian grief was more than a private thing. Naturally, the Egyptian missed those whom he loved. But he did not grieve for them. He grieved for himself because they were gone. He was sorry to lose them. It never occurred to him that they were badly off or had any particular need of him. As one of the Egyptians says of one of the dead, "Thou hast so little need of me, and I so much of thee." And that was his attitude. If there was any real consoling to be done, it should be bestowed upon the living. They were the ones who might have to change their ways of life, might have to make adjustments, might have to bring up children fatherless or motherless. They were the ones who had the harder part, because actually those departing followed the way of all life. It was just as natural and normal as changing your clothes. And it was the larger sorrow for those who remained here. But the soul, passing on, had certain problems to confront, because the Egyptian, as his religion tells us, was a serious man as far as his codes of principles were concerned. Like all ancient peoples, he regarded his future happiness as closely associated with his obedience to the laws of his faith. This did not necessarily mean in Egypt that he had to worship a particular god or at a particular shrine. There were no sermons, there were no sects and creeds as we know them. We are not even sure that the Egyptian had a religious textbook. because the only books we associate with him in religion are those associated with his dead. We do not know that he had anything that corresponds to a Bible. We do not know that he had any version available to him of words attributed to his God or anything of that nature. But he was permeated with a code that extended throughout his culture. And this code was a very simple one, essentially. It was a code to keep the law, both the law of God and the law of man, to live uprightly, to pay his debts, and to leave this world a better place than he found it, if such was possible to him. That he should not have inordinate attachments, unreasonable desires, or selfish ambitions. And the great negative confession of the dead, as found in the book of Coming Forth by Day, tells us that if he in any way took seriously this tremendous credo, he must have been a reasonably honorable man, because I doubt very much if anyone could say upon obligation and oath today that he was doing it well. Now the Egyptologist laughs it off, and we must give him his due, because you will hear from him again someday. He tells us that the Egyptian never attempted to live it. If he did not attempt to live it, then his entire religion was a travesty. And we are inclined to doubt that that is possible. Men do not build such tremendous things. They do not sacrifice for so many centuries, bestowing all that they have upon the glory of their gods, simply because they are not believers, or because it means nothing to them. In Egypt, as in modern Israel, men built first the temple, then the home. And that is the concept everywhere in that world. We cannot believe that it was totally insincere. More likely, more reasonably, the Egyptian realized, as we all realize, that he would fall short of perfection. But like us, he had a hope. In fact, he had several hopes. Some of them rather concrete, at least to his thinking. One was that the world was ruled by a God who had suffered and died as he would suffer and die, betrayed by his own brother. Furthermore, that this God had given birth out of himself to an eternal Son, his own beloved and only embodiment, and that this Son was an intercessor for the souls of the dead, and that the Son, speaking to his Father, asked forgiveness for those who fell short. The Egyptian also believed that a degree of failure was not as catastrophic as it would be in a different type of religion. Because, remember, he believed that there was a gate of the west through which he would pass into darkness, but also another gate in the east from which he would be reborn. He therefore held the doctrine of rebirth. And this gave him a conviction that perhaps he was not intended to be perfect all at once. He was rather intended to do as well as he could and be able to honestly say that he tried, and tried hard. And that seems to be the principal thing required of him. Beyond that, at the time of death, he was given a series of formulas, magical invocations, which he neither understood nor was able to generally apply. But each of these formulas would take him by one of the guardians of the darkness, and therefore would bring him safely into the judgment hall where his true nature could be properly and honorably assessed. For Osiris was also a god whose body was filled with eyes, as in the story of the Papyrus of Ani. And the eyes of the god Osiris saw in all things and in all directions and through everything, seeing the hearts in things, and not deceived by the appearances or even by the minds of those things. Thus the Egyptian probably had a faith, a reasonable belief of a probable salvation. He also recognized, however, that in this world he got poor training for another world. Long before it had ever occurred to the majority of Western men, the Egyptian was beginning to estimate the problem of what he was going to do when he got into these wonderful houses of Amentet. He was not foolish enough to really think that he could plow the back 40 acres in the Elysian fields. He was not so completely lacking in imagination that he assumed that he could continue forever to have his slaves or to build monuments to his own memory, which may have been one of his principal avocations during life. Speaking of all this monument building, there is another interesting thought. Records have been found to indicate that all these great monuments were not necessarily testimonials to egoism, because the records tell us that there were great famines in the land, or that the Nile failed, and that the crops failed, and that there was no work for men. And one of the edicts says, and Pharaoh say, that no man can be honorable if he is merely supported by another. Said it is wiser to provide work out of the treasury, so that all men will still be paid for what they do, and idleness will not be rewarded. Now, we could bear that in mind on a number of occasions. Pharaoh apparently did have a God whispering in his ear at that moment. But in any event, the Egyptian, assuming that the soul had passed in its own way through the great trial, the psychostasia, which we have described to you on many occasions, and which perhaps we can not go into detail in again. The psychostasia does not represent an arbitrary code. The psychostasia did not mean that all men must pass the same test, for there was not some blazing covenant upon the walls of heaven. Each man had to be weighed according to his heart and its relation to truth. Therefore, if his heart was simple and he kept the law, the balance was still maintained, and he was permitted to pass on. Heaven was not for the scholar alone, for the wise man, or for the man who had cultivated virtues knowingly all his life. The great judgment's hall also found it good to weigh the heart of the simple man and reward him according to his simple works. No more was requested. He was not expected to know what truth was. He was only expected to keep the faith he had and live according to the good in his own light. So he passes on according to the Egyptian legends and fables, and in life he was a man of consequence, a very popular man in the community. He was the moneylender. Now, the moneylender in Egypt usually had his office on the steps of a prominent building. Here he set up his little scale and charged as usurious a rate of interest as the conditions would permit. But if he was a good moneylender at heart and believed in his gods, he gave honest weights and measures. He charged the rate that was the legal fee, proper and appointed. And perhaps occasionally, when some rather destitute person came along, he was a little larger-hearted than the law demanded, took only 5% when he might have had 6. But anyway, we will assume, in this case, that he was a good moneylender. And there was such a man in one of the old papyruses, and we know about it. And we know that he balanced his scales at the portico of the Temple of Ra. And there, He advanced funds on this and foreclosed funds on that. And the time came and he passed on. And apparently he got through the great examination with some credit. Evidently he had not put his fist on one end of the scales when he weighed things. And because of that, he passed into one of the rooms of a mentat in the Great Hall of Iron. And so what did he do? What would you naturally think he would do? Found a good spot and set up business. Now we may wonder just what kind of a heaven it is if somebody else had to borrow money. It would make heaven almost too unheaven-like for most of us and too heavenly for the usurer. The books do not tell us who borrowed from him. Perhaps no one did. Perhaps in the afterworld no one needed to. Perhaps it was all that he required was to realize that he was doing business on the same old corner, or one like it. But the Egyptian did not assume that death would separate or change these values. It might take the body away from the money changer, but it would not change him. So in the plains of Amentet, we have a situation set up that is very similar to the Hindu philosophy. Namely that in the afterlife, we live on in the consciousness that we have already developed, whatever it may be. The story of the moneylender is probably fabulous, but at the same time, it points the principle that heaven, for each man, must be the place of his own fulfillment. He must do the things he believes. He must find the rewards he expects. And a heaven suitable to Socrates would be very, very unsuitable to the moneylender, and vice versa. Those who have sought great and wonderful truths would not be satisfied with their little ethereal cottage on the ship by the side of the eternal sea. Each, according to his inner life, passes into another world. There goes on being himself, dreaming the dreams that have kept him and maintained him or directed him during his mortal existence. Now, if this person did not pass the great judgment, he might go to places which were not so pleasant. But there was no concept of hell. What he really did was to go to the kind of a place that he had created upon the earth. If he had made a bedlam out of his home, he would find a magnificent domestic bedlam waiting for him. He would go right on, causing the troubles and experiencing them. Because the Egyptian had already learned, as the Greeks learned from him, and they have told us, that the Egyptian concept of the afterlife was that each individual lived in the consequences of his own conduct. That the afterlife was the place where man lived with himself. That after the body was no longer there, and his faculties were no longer objectified and focused upon material things, this focus of power moved inward and settled within the magnetic field, so to say, of his own emotional mental life. Here the individual came face to face with himself. Here he had to get along with himself. And if the way we do it here is indicative, it would be well possible that over there he might have troubles at times. The individual who did not have a nice self to get along with was miserable. The individual who died of the excesses of dissipation, of selfishness, of greed, this individual had to face the sorrows which he had caused. not because some deity did it, but because within himself was a tremendous complex of destructive forces from which he was not separated by death. This went on with him. This was the demon that tormented him. This is the power of Apep to beguile him. For he had fallen under the illusion, had failed to serve the gods, and had failed to seek the good. And for these failures, he must live in darkness. Now, in the Egyptian mythological concept of the afterlife, the lowest and the most negative of all these houses in Amenhotep was the house of the great sleeping. If the individual had within himself no light, no dream, or if in the terms of the ancient times he died denying the gods and denying his own sharing in them and denying his own part in the afterlife, this had no essential effect upon his drifting into this world beyond, but it meant that he drifted there with a state of internal rejection. As the old texts tell us, this man, though still alive, refused to live. He said, "I am dead," and never questioned who was saying it or how the dead could know that they are dead. He had preconceived his own destruction, his own annihilation, or through the evil of a conscience had declared that he was not fit to live. And upon his departure was utterly and completely ashamed of his conduct in life and realized or believed that no good could come to him. Such as these, according to the Egyptians, were like those described in the visions of Aeneas, sleeping in the darkness. They were sleeping in strange, dark recesses. And when some came among them and shook them, they mumbled, "Disturb me not, for I am dead." And the Egyptians said that the only person who could say this was the person who believed in death. That death was a believing in death, and that there was no death but that believing. But having believed and being convinced of belief, man defends the belief with his own life. He cannot destroy himself. Therefore, he can only decline or reject the conscious existence of that which he is. So he sleeps. And if the present trend of materialism continues to flourish, areas in that particular region may become a bit congested. Because there are many who today claim at least to believe that there is no life after death. The Egyptian, however, held that this great sleep was not eternal, because a man can even be tired of being dead. He can even exhaust his own determination to prove that he is right. And because the maintenance of error requires continual vigilance, and he must carefully preserve his own darkness, he becomes weary, lets go, gives up, and like the man who has clung overlong to a piece of wreckage, decides that it is easier to be drowned. In this case, easier to believe than to deny, easier to live than to die. Because according to the Egyptian, men have to cling to death. If they let go, they live. Now, if the soul finally lets go, and it will sometime, because eternity can outlast the stubbornness of the most adamant creature. So eternity is patient, and it always wins. So when men let go of this unbelieving, we are reminded of the vision that is recorded in one of the rituals of the Eleusinian, where the candid state sees the great waves of sleeping souls flowing by him in the river of life. And the souls that have finally let go of the fixation of death find that they are floating, asleep perhaps, partly awake, but floating on and on, joining together like streams with all those souls flowing from the other gates, until all the gates merge and mingle, and the great stream pours back into life through the great doorway of the east. And in flowing back into life, they behold, as they approach, Anubis standing again upon the horizon, this time the horizon of the east. And we are remembered of a certain symbol of two St. Johns standing at the equinoctial and solstical points of a sphere. We are reminded of the gates of the east and west. And here Anubis stands ready as a bandmaster or the leader of a parade to act as the psychopompus or the herder of the secret and sleeping souls. And as they gather at the gate, dawn comes, and out of the great stream flows the wonderful ship of Osiris, the luminous bark of the dawn, and in it is the god surrounded by light. And upon the ship are the souls of the redeemed. They flow with him into the great mystery of the day. Therefore, life, birth, is a coming forth by day. Death is a going forth by night. And there are 2 nights and there are 2 days. And both kinds are parts of day because they belong to the mystery of the sky and the air, are in the keeping of Isis, mother of mysteries, who must give birth to the man-child for the salvation of the world. And those who come forth by day come forth under the patronage of the mother, and they are born. And those who go forth into darkness by night and death meet there the dark virgin Nephthys, who gives them birth into the underworld. Now there is a second coming forth by day. For unless a man be born again, he shall not know the kingdom of God. And that which is called the second birth is the house of the great mystery, the great house of the Lord of Amenhotep, the great white house of Memphis. For this is the house of initiation into the great rituals, the house of the second birth. And over this presides again Isis, for Isis is the mystery temple, the mother of the sons, the mother, the widow, whose son shall inherit the earth. So all those who come forth by day are, as Kipling says in his poem, we are the sons of the widow. And because Victoria thought he meant her, she refused him knighthood for a number of years. That egocentric old lady didn't realize that there was anything in widowhood beyond the weeds of Windsor. But the widow is Isis seeking for her Lord. It is nature seeking for the hero, for the great power that is to redeem it, and which is fashioned in the image of the Hierophant, or the Lord of the Mysteries. So souls coming into birth or rebirth materially following the great way, a path of light, the rippling left behind by the ship of Osiris as it cuts through the sea and the sky. But Osiris also rules in that other ship, the house of the mysteries, the ship of the doctrine. And those who come forth in this house, into the house of truth, shall never again know night. For in the land of the redeemed there shall be no darkness. And in this concept, Osiris then becomes the Lord of the coming forth by day, the Lord of man's conscious decision to dedicate himself to truth, and to leave the shadows of birth and death as they burden the average man, to step into the immortal light of ever-consciousness. And those who achieve this immortal light are the Hashesti, the radiant hawk-headed ones. For the hawk is the Egyptian phoenix, the symbol of the reborn, that which has risen triumphantly from its own dead. For the phoenix is born from its own body. And these, the Hashesti, become the luminous ones who ride with Osiris in the ship of the sky. And they are the ones to whom he gives dominion over the air and the earth, and over the powers of the sun. And they are the ones who in the last great war shall form the army of the enlightened, and shall end forever the power of Apep, the serpent of darkness, the symbol of illusion. For light alone, the light of the soul, rescues man from illusion. So the Egyptian believed there is an overworld of truth in which the sun, as light and truth, rides supreme. There is an underworld of darkness, which is only illusion. And as Akhenaten himself said, actually, death is only a dreaming from which men waken into the love of God. So we cannot say the Egyptian was not a pious man, or that he did not have a wonderful and beautiful philosophy if we wish to look for it. Everything depends upon the way we approach it. 600 years before the beginning of the Christian era, Thales of Miletus was raised to great honor, and naturally, desiring to be a good citizen of Greece, he went to study in Egypt. Another great Greek, Solon, appointed Archon of Athens, and confronted with the problem of the mortgage stones, which had wrecked the economy of Greece, went to Egypt in search of wisdom. Pythagoras beat his body against the temple of Thebes for years, begging admission. The ancient world of the Mediterranean made its long and constant pilgrimage to the temples of Egypt, because men realized that there was a strange knowledge about the reality of things. And they knew that the Egyptians, under geometrical forms and solids, made likenesses of all their gods, and that they mostly were wise in the mystery of the soul, the journey of the soul through life and death, through darkness, the underworld, and out again into the great light of day, through the blazing gateway of the east. So the ancient Egyptians recognized three conditions. They hailed Osiris at his rising, saying, "Behold, he is the dawn." They venerated him at the meridian, saying, "Behold, this is the light that casts no shadow." For at noon there is no shadow. And they hailed him the third time, "Great Osiris of the sun in its setting, we venerate you, we adore you. For you are in your dawning the creator of all things, and in your meridian the preserver of all things, and in your setting the transformer of all things, from one life to another." And the Egyptian also declared that there are 3 stations of the underworld. The gate of the west, which is the beginning of darkness, and is at the horizon of the double truths. Then there is the nadir, midnight, darkness, the lowest and deepest point of obscuration, where only the lunar Osiris floats in his little ship of the crescent orb. Then there is the 3rd gate of the underworld, or the 3rd station, which is the east, where the soul comes forth, perfected into light. Therefore, these 3 steps represent the 3 degrees of the mysteries by which men are regenerated, and the 3 degrees of life. For man must overcome not only the body, which is the west, but his desires, which are the south, and also his thoughts, which are the east. He must master them all and conquer them and pass through them into life. Now that the Egyptian had this type of belief, I think we can appreciate how it profoundly influenced the rise of many other systems, including many phases of Jewish philosophy. In a very ancient inscription to Osiris, found in Egypt at a long and remote time, long before the captivity of the Jews, there is an inscription which says, "Hail, Osiris Eloha." Now, that is a peculiar thing to find in Egypt, because Eloha is, of course, the root and source of the term Elohim, or the name bestowed by the ancient Jewish people upon the creating power. The great division of Judaistic religious philosophy is based upon the Elohistic concept, as opposed to the later Jehovistic. So that Osiris Eloah, or Osiris Lord, indicates perhaps that from the temples of the Egyptians it may well be true, according even to the biblical story, that Moses learned a great deal, for it is said of him that he was learned in the wisdom of Egypt. We know that the tabernacle of the Jews was patterned upon the Egyptian temples, and that the Ark of the Covenant is magnificently traced in stone upon the walls of the Temple of Bailing. These parallels may cause us to assume that out of the mysteries of Egyptian religion came many things. In ancient Syrian and Assyrian culture, and perhaps as late as the apocalyptic writings of St. John. For the judgment in St. John is certainly the psychostasia of the Book of the Dead. The judgment, the division, the restoration, the spiritual life of man over the darkness of the grave. We have comparatively few legends about these things. We know that in the psychostasia, at one period, it was believed that those who failed were devoured by Python, who was present at the great testing, and who swallowed up the soul of the imperfect dead and voided it through his body. Of Typhon is the hippocampus, the creature of the Nile, the symbol of matter. Then that matter should swallow up the imperfect dead is almost a complete statement of rebirth, because Typhon was the lord of the objective material world, and he reclaimed those who failed in the test. Here we are again reminded of an interesting line in the Apocalypse, about which there has been much controversy, but it is perfectly good Egyptian philosophy. Whoso overcometh, him will I make a pillar in the house of my God, and he shall go no more out. This is a peculiar statement, but it parallels identically the concept of Typhon. In other words, those who do not overcome must go out again. And through Typhon they are reborn into a world of limitation and restriction. Like the Greek, the Egyptian did not resent rebirth. He did not even question it. He did not consider it a punishment for anything. Like the life itself, it was an opportunity. Mistakes would arise, tragedy would come, but life was good. And because it was good, it was worth living. And because it was worth living, man was forever grateful for it. And he was forever grateful for the conviction in himself that because of the infinite love and wisdom of his deities, his own life was eternal. He also believed that sometime, somewhere, some way, this great journey of birth and rebirth would end. He believed that sometime he would no longer be imperfect, and it would not be necessary for him to go out. And that when he had achieved to this end, he would have a place in everlastingness and be forever with his God. But again, because of the very concept that she had of God, based upon the same numerical speculations which later inspired Pythagoras to develop the monad theory, for the Egyptians were the source of his information, as he himself admitted. The Egyptian could not conceive of ultimate existence apart from his God. Even in the psychostasia, the deceased person is no longer himself. He is Osiris. When the priest Ani enters the underworld in the great papyrus named after him, he is referred to thereafter as Osiris who was Ani. He has ceased to have an existence apart from his God. He has returned into a nature in which there is no essential division between himself and the divine. This is apparently an implication of a superphysical state. He stands forming the aspect of the Ka, which is the symbol that he is a soul, a being out of body. But he also held that at the end of things, he would not be a god. He knew, some way, mysteriously, that there was but one supreme power. In spite of the fact that the Egyptologists deny this, the entire structure of Egyptian theology requires it. And therefore, he must end by identification. Even in death, he becomes Osiris. In the last great enlightenment, which is the final unification of himself in eternity, he is truly Osiris. He is one with God, in glory and in splendor, one eternal. He is not a god. He does not live in a paradise with God, for these houses of Amenta pass away. They are only part of worldliness, part of an illusion. Half of this illusion objective, half of it subjective. Death and the afterlife are dreams, just as living, physical living, is a dream to the Egyptian. There is only one final waking, and that is through the second birth, the mystery of truth, the internal enlightenment. When this comes, when the second birth comes, the soul is perfectly and completely Osirified. That is, it becomes the God. It becomes not a God or one of the gods, but the very being itself. For there can be but one being, and all else is unreal, because God and God alone is real. Realizing this, we have a very high concept of the abstract end of this path of growth. Perhaps this concept was taken partly from Asia, where it was long taught as part of the secret mysteries of India. For we know that the Osiris cult is said to have been driven from India to Egypt in the form of a bull, or under the symbol of Apis. And Apis, of course, is the sun at the equinox, or the symbol of the breaking of the egg of the year, for the horns of the celestial bull, which plows the furrows of stars and releases the spirits of the seeds from the sky. These things give us perhaps a little concept, and let us think about it. Is it so very much less realistic than our own? Is it essentially any different? Have we any better answer? Do we have any nobler concept than that we shall pass into a compensation or a condition suitable to ourselves, and that we shall live to grow and to learn until finally we merit enlightenment, and that through this enlightenment we become one with God? It seems to me that it would be hard to fail to see the essential sublimity of this concept, and perhaps even to admire the tremendously adroit use of symbols, so that profane centuries could never solve the mystery. And like the secrets of the glyphs themselves, the sacerdotal secrets are locked in shadows, in statues, in carvings, and in fragments of ancient papyrus. Yet if we are inclined to assume that they knew little and we know much, perhaps this is only what Hermes predicted over 2,000 years ago, when gazing upon the ruins of Egypt, he declares that the time would come when races and nations would rise and would really and honestly believe that the Egyptian had no ideals and no dreams, that he did not understand, that he worshipped beasts and birds. But Hermes pointed out that those very ones who accused him would also be worshipping beasts and birds of some kind. That those who did not believe he knew would themselves be bowing down to false gods. So perhaps Hermes was not so far from it. But anyway, this gives us perhaps a little panorama of the Egyptian life way as it relates particularly to life after death.